go ahead and pray first, just because. Lord, I thank you for all these people here who showed up tonight, and I pray that you would be here with us, Lord, and help us to discover your truth, God, and help us to draw closer to you in everything that we do, Lord. We set our hearts and our minds on you tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. My name is Duran. The topic of the Shroud of Turin has been a fascination of mine for years, and I'm giddy to talk about it tonight. So let's just go ahead and just jump into this. One thing though. I will say this: since Ratio Christi is an apologetics organization, obviously, we're going to talk about apologetics tonight, but this is the weird side of apologetics. I mean, it just is, because most of the time when we talk about apologetics, we're talking about philosophy, like teleological and cosmological arguments for God, and science, and creation versus evolution, stuff like that, and history, and is the historical Jesus real, and can we trust the Bible, the historical texts, and can we trust that kind of stuff? But every now and then, just something weird happens. And, most religions, I think, have artifacts that they treasure greatly. And for the most part, those artifacts typically tend to be really questionable, and it's like, well, that's just an old piece of wood, Like, for instance, I know that there is a highly revered spearhead that is believed to be the spear that pierced Jesus' side, and this thing is being held up in a Catholic church somewhere, and nobody's allowed to touch it or test it or anything. So, I saw a documentary on it once, and it's just like, no way. So, the purpose of me saying that now is that the Shroud of Turin is weird, and I'm going to leave it to you guys tonight about whether or not it's authentic. I'll tell you what I think at the end, although it's probably obvious by now. But the fact is it's weird. And when we reach out to non-believers, when we discuss things that are crucial to defending the faith, Shroud of Turin should not be on your list of things, unless they just like talking about weird stuff. So this is kind of like, consider the Shroud of Turin the deleted scene of apologetics. It is because I'm a film major, that's the way I would put it. It's the deleted scene of apologetics is because it fits, but it's probably better for the flow of the conversation that we just ignore it for the time being. But tonight, we're going to see the deleted scene. So, this is the bonus, the appendix, the appendices of Christianity. So here is the Shroud of Turin. Who here has never really delved into this subject at all? Who has no idea? Yes.
There's a lot of us.
Yes.
Yeah.
You are in for a treat tonight. All right. I'm going to start out with a question. Who is this?
Jesus.
Oh,
Jimmy.
Some guy.
Yeah, that's not Jesus, that's Jim Caviezel. See, there he is with Mel Gibson on the set of The Passion of the Christ.
Oh my God.
Great movie. So here's the question though. Why did they cast Jim Caviezel as Jesus?
Because he looks like him.
Because he looks like him. Wait a second. Does he really look like him? I mean, Jim Caviezel doesn't even have brown eyes, he has blue eyes.
He's like the epitome of Byzantine Jesus.
Yeah. So they digitized his eyes for the movie. They colored him brown. But the point is this: how do we know what Jesus looked like? We read about him. I don't know what I'm pointing at. We read about him in the Bible, but there's no pictures. There's no divinely inspired pictures of Jesus in the Bible, are there? So how do we know what he looked like? And moreover, how do we know anything about Jesus at all? I mean, how do we know? Sure, we have the Bible, and we have other kind of historical texts that point us in that direction. But for the record, though, tonight, as much as I would love to talk about the historical evidence for Jesus, and I will actually be giving another presentation on that in April, we are just going to assume, for the sake of the Shroud of Turin, we just have to assume that some things are that we just have some things. For instance, we're just going to go ahead and assume that the Gospels are reliable, because we don't have time to get into all that. So, and there's also some other sources related to the Shroud of Turin that we're just going to have to kind of, I mean, this is just how it goes with the Shroud of Turin anyway. You just have to take everything with a grain of salt. I mean, I'm going to do my best to tell you what is most reliable and what isn't. But and most of the, well, anyway, here we go. So, beginning of the story, most of you are probably already familiar with this. Around 30 to 33 AD, Jesus of Nazareth began his ministry around in the Galilee, Jerusalem area of Israel, and he did a lot of cool things. He did, healings and all sorts of neat stuff, and all of that's recorded in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. I changed the order because Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, and Matthew built off of that, and Luke likely built off of Matthew a little bit, and John just kind of did his own thing. But in the middle of this, while this was happening, there is a legend that we have, according to the Christian historian Eusebius, who did live from 260 AD to 340 AD, well after this. So not sure where this is coming from. But there is a legend that in 32 AD, King Abgar V of Edessa became sick with leprosy. And you can see, of course, Edessa's up here in where modern Turkey is, and this is down here where Jesus was. So it was quite a distance to travel, and Jesus did a good bit of walking around, but he never really left this spot here. So King Abgar of Edessa got sick, and he heard about the things that Jesus was doing down in Jerusalem. He heard that he was healing a bunch of people. So King Abgar sent a letter to Jesus. This is according to the legend. He sent a letter to Jesus asking Jesus to come to Edessa to heal him of his leprosy. Jesus responded with a letter, supposedly, either a letter or orally, that he couldn't make it, but he promised that he was going to send a disciple to Abgar later on. And it's uncertain about what time frame he was given. So I'm sure that Abgar was probably disappointed to hear that, but for the purposes of the story, we're just going to keep on moving. So in 33 AD, we come to the end of Jesus' ministry, or is it? Because, as you already know, Jesus was arrested for blasphemy, and a certain sequence of events happened to Jesus here at the end of his life, or was it? He was beaten by soldiers. He was tried and convicted of blasphemy, of claiming to be God. He was flogged with a Roman scourge, or a flagrum. A crown of thorns was weaved together, and it was put on his head and pressed down into his head. This is all according to the Gospels. He was forced to carry his cross down the street and up the hill to Golgotha, where he was then crucified, meaning nails were put through his hands and a nail was put through both of his feet, was crucified to the cross, and when it appeared that he was dead on the cross, a Roman soldier stabbed him with a Roman spear, and blood and water came out of his lungs, or came out of his side. This is all recorded in the Gospels, and like I said, I'm pretty sure that most of you know that part of the story. It's just good to reiterate it for the sake of the Shroud of Turin. So then one of Jesus' followers, one of his more wealthy followers, Joseph of Arimathea, he got permission from Pontius Pilate to take Jesus' body and bury him in his own tomb, in Joseph of Arimathea's brand new tomb. And it would have been nice because he was a rich man, but he also cared very much for Jesus and thought very highly of him. So in Mark it says, then he, being Joseph of Arimathea, bought fine linen, took him down from the cross, and wrapped him in the linen, and he laid him in a tomb. That's Mark 15:46. Matthew says something similar. When Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his new tomb. Luke, then he took it down, wrapped it in linen, and laid it in a tomb. Starting to think maybe this is an important detail. Then they took the body of Jesus and bound it in strips of linen with the spices, as the custom of the Jews is to bury. So there's John doing his own thing. So now we have Jesus dead, wrapped in a linen cloth, a nice linen cloth, in the tomb. And probably most of you know what happens next. There's a plot twist. Suddenly, the dead body of Jesus disappears 3 days later. And guess what's left behind in the tomb? Peter arose and ran to the tomb, and stooping down, he saw the linen cloths lying by themselves. According to Luke, and according to John, he saw the linen cloths lying there, and the handkerchief that had been around his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded together in a place by itself. Take note of that for now, that there seem to have been two pieces, according to John. Now, obviously, Jesus shows up, shows himself to the disciples, he's resurrected, he does some stuff, does some more healings, does some more miracles, shows himself to a bunch of more people, and then he ascends into heaven. This is what the Gospels record. And then the rest of the New Testament affirms that the disciples did some stuff as well for a period of time. Now, now I want to go back to King Abgar V of Edessa. So, according to Eusebius, the Apostle Thomas, who is the one, doubting Thomas, who touched Jesus' palms when he asked to touch Jesus, that was the only way he was going to believe that Jesus was resurrected. The Apostle Thomas sent his disciple Thaddeus, who is possibly Jude, who possibly wrote the Epistle of Jude near the end of the New Testament. He sent him back to Edessa, where he healed a bunch of people, and he had a certain cloth on him. King Abgar was still sick with his leprosy. This was probably only maybe 2 or 3 years later. He heard about it, and so he sent for Thaddeus. Thaddeus brings the cloth to Abgar, prays over him, and he's healed. He's healed of his leprosy. This is the legend according to Eusebius. So King Abgar converts to Christianity. I'm not sure what he was before that. I think he was just kind of a pagan. And then Christianity becomes popular in Edessa and remains that way until Abgar's grandson, Manu VI, reverts back to paganism, and in 57 AD he starts to persecute the Christians of Edessa. And the cloth is lost. Well, I mean, we don't even know what happened to it. We don't even know what the deal was with the cloth in the first place. All we know, according to the legend, is that Thaddeus had this cloth, and supposedly it had some healing powers to it. So in 57 AD, everything is not, things are bad in Odessa. From here, I want to take a break from kind of the history here and think about, even though there was persecution going on in Odessa, obviously Christianity was starting to spread all over the world, right? I mean, we know this because, it made it all over the world. And so naturally, what you think is going to happen is that people are going to start probably trying to paint pictures of Jesus, right? But the only problem is well, only this small group of people in Jerusalem really saw Jesus, really knew what he looked like. So by the time Christianity spread around the world, nobody really knew what he looked like. So we have some paintings. This was discovered just a few years ago. It's highly contested as to whether or not it is actually Jesus. It was found in Egypt. It's thought to be an ancient 1st century painting of Jesus. 1st century, that's like almost right after everything happened. But the distinct thing about the picture, though, is that the figure is standing up. This is the whole picture. He's standing up. He's using his hand to bless people. Actually, here it looks like he's doing like the Vulcan symbol. But
actually, in Judaism, this is the gesture given by the priests if they were to do stuff to people. They would be like,
oh, cool, awesome. Well, it fits perfectly then. Maybe I guess that's part of it. But the main thing about his face that I want to point out is that he doesn't have a beard, and that he has kind of curly hair. And maybe it's hard to see, but that is the case. He doesn't have a beard, he has kind of curly hair. And, let's face it, when people think about a famous figure, they tend to kind of imagine, they tend to project their own image onto him. So we have possible 1st or 3rd century, this is a Romanized picture of Jesus depicting him as the Good Shepherd, because the parables and the Gospels are starting to spread now. This is a fresco in the catacombs of St. Priscilla in Rome. You're going to be seeing a lot of Roman art today. Again, notice that he doesn't have a beard, and he has very short hair. And he looks really young as well. He looks like a little boy. This is a 3rd century fresco of the same concept, Jesus as the Good Shepherd. This is also in Rome. Again, he has short hair, and I guess the way the projector does it almost looks like he has a beard, but he doesn't. He's holding something in his hand here, but he doesn't have a beard. But he does look more like a man than the last shepherd boy, I guess. This is a 3rd century fresco of Jesus with his disciples. Not sure what the scene is. Not sure if he's like feeding the 5,000, or if he's calming the sea, or if this is supposed to be the Last Supper, or what. But the main thing is again, notice that he has long hair in this one, and still no beard. It's very dark. All of them are very dark. So the main thing to notice here, and here's a 4th century mosaic from England actually. Again, he's just kind of got very English hair and clean shaven. Is even through the 4th century, people have entirely different concepts of what Jesus looked like. So what did he look like? Well, cue the year 525 AD, a large flood struck Odessa, where they had persecuted the Christians almost 500 years prior to. Many people were killed and a lot of buildings were destroyed. And while they were trying to repair a section of the wall, a hole was discovered in the wall that had a cloth inside. Good, yes. The cloth seemed to have an image of Jesus on it. And so the people of Edessa started to think to themselves, well, what if 500 years ago, almost 500 years ago, what if those Christians that we were persecuting hid this cloth in the wall to keep it safe? From then on, it became known as the image of Edessa. And this was a highly, highly venerated artifact. The people of Edessa treasured this thing incredibly. This was almost like, if you recall in the Old Testament, the story of when, I think it's King Josiah, he discovers the law. You know, like they find the book of the law, and he suddenly reads it for the first time, or the prophet reads it to him for the first time, and he's like, oh my gosh, we've got to completely change our ways. We've got to get rid of all the high places and all the idols and all of that. We've got to, this was that kind of big deal for the people of Edessa. They treasured this artifact so much. Here's a newspaper clipping from 525 AD. I'm just kidding. The point is that this is supposedly what the image of Edessa looked like. When it says image of Jesus, this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. Notice that he has pierced hands and pierced feet. And also notice that he has long hair and he has a beard. So this image of Jesus, because it's highly respected now, what we start to see, and of course the people of Edessa, they don't keep this thing a secret. They start talking to everybody, and suddenly all of our pictures of Jesus change. This is from the 6th century. Sinai, a monastery. This is a very famous, it's called the Pantocrator. A lot of artists actually copied this painting. There's a gajillion versions of it, including this one. It's a 7th century Gothic Egyptian version. This other guy, his name was Abbot Minute. He was the superior of the monastery in Bami in Egypt. Again, we see that this picture of Jesus seems to be consistent with this image of Edessa. The image of Edessa seems to become the standard for what Jesus looked like. Here's an 8th century picture of the image of Edessa. What the people of Edessa did is, instead of showing the whole thing, because it was a whole image of Jesus, what they did was they folded it in a certain way so that only the face was visible. And they would hang it up in certain places in the city at certain times, and that was kind of like their call to prayer, and they would go and they would pray to it, and they would bow down to it. And so it was a big deal to them. You can see this is a very ornate picture. So images, these consistent images of Jesus just started popping up everywhere. I mean, here's the 11th century Greece, the mosaic. I mean, you even got people making toast differently. Anyway. So in 944 AD, the image of Edessa had become so popular that the Byzantine Emperor Romanus Lucicanus seized the cloth because he wanted to add it to his collection of Christian relics in Constantinople. From there, the cloth is now referred to as the Mandylion, not the Mandelion, even though Mandelion sounds fun to say. But it's the Mandylion. The Mandylion is going to be our first, everything up until now, except for the paintings that I've showed you, everything up until now has been very much legend based. I mean, we know that the image of it, we know that the Mandylion came from Edessa, and that the people of Edessa had the image of Edessa, but we don't really know much about kind of how they got it. This is a legend that was passed on that eventually came to Eusebius, the Christian historian Eusebius. Well, that's the Mandylion. It was highly revered, obviously, but they didn't put it out on display. They didn't show it to people. They just kept it locked up with the collection. So there's not really any verification available to say. The history of the Mandylion is very blurry. It is going to start coming into much sharper focus soon. But what happens is in 1204, Constantinople was sacked by France, and the Mandylion was seized by the Knights Templar. Now, the Knights Templar, they were the heroes, and they were also highly devout Christians. And the Knights Templar, they did their thing. They loved the Mandylion, and they loved Christian relics, so they folded this thing up the same way that the people of Edessa did. They folded it up so that only the head would show, and it was often described in some ancient sources as a floating head, that the Knights Templar would pray to a floating head. And when they would bring men into their order of knights, part of their initiation was to face this image and to bow down to it. Notice how the rest of the cloth is kind of falling off of the table there. And also notice that it's given this divine significance. So this is the Mandylion in the possession of the Knights Templar. Well, what happens next is there are several possibilities for what happens next. The main thing that happens is that the Grand Master of the Templars, his name was Jacques de Molay, he was burned at the stake along with the master of the order in Normandy, his name was Geoffrey de Charnay. Now that name is important. It should be noted that they were burned at the stake for heresy. They got in trouble by the Catholic Church for essentially doing blasphemous things, one of which, being noted, was praying to an idolatrous floating head. The Catholic Church has never really been a big fan of iconography. Well, I'm sorry, that's not true. But they are against idolatry for sure. And to them, the Knights Templar were crossing the line with this Mandylion thing that they seem to have on them. What happens next is, again, a little blurry. A different Geoffrey de Charnay, it's a slightly different spelling, so Geoffrey de Charnay was burned at the stake, but a different guy named Geoffrey de Charnay, he begins to make a name for himself in the military of France. And although he cannot be the son of the Templar Charnay, since the Knights took a vow of chastity, the similarity in the name could mean that he was a relative. It's possible that since Charnay, who was burned at the stake, was a high-ranking knight in the Knights Templar, that he personally had access to the Mandylion. And so it's possible that when he was gone, it's possible that his household just kind of passed the thing on. And since it was kind of part of the reason why they were burned at the stake, nobody really wanted to claim it, so to speak. So it took a few years, but eventually, this is where the direct historical evidence of the Shroud begins, of the Shroud of Turin begins. because this is the point where we come to where we can finally say, surprise, we think that the Shroud of Turin is actually the Mandilion that was passed down through the Knights of Templar, and therefore by extension it would also be the image of Edessa. So this is Charny, not Charnay, who was burned at the stake, but Charny, who likely inherited the Mandilion. You can see it has the image of Jesus, not just the head, but the whole body, and you can see that it's long.
When was that window? Do you have a date for the window?
Yes. He would have inherited that in 1337. And then 20 years later, in 1357, Jeff here was killed in the Battle of Poitiers in France. And he left behind his wife, and she became poor. So what she decided to do, in an attempt to make some money, is she decided to start putting the Mandilion on display, even though it was a highly controversial thing. And by that time, probably not many people knew that it was real, for one thing, because for all anybody knew, it was an artifact that might have been destroyed. So that was when they stopped calling it the Mandilion, because she didn't want it to be associated with what happened to the Knights Templar, so she just started calling it Shroud. So she wanted to make some money. So she started displaying it, and it eventually became actually kind of a profitable business, because this is in the 14th or 15th century. This was a medallion that was sold to pilgrims who would come to Liry, France, to see the shroud. And here's an interesting thing. This is a picture of the shroud. What you see here is supposedly Jesus. Here's his head, here's his body, and here, that's his front side, and this would be his back side. Around this time is when it starts to become clear that the shroud / Mandilion / image of Edessa is not actually just a front side image, but it's also a back side image. How is that possible? Well, if it's the cloth that Jesus was wrapped in, he would have been lying on this side, face up, and then this end would have been folded over him. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. So, and like I said, it's really not clear how the Charnies came in possession of the Mandilion. There's a couple of different ways to do it, but the fact is that they had it. I mean, that is the historical fact that they had it. Let's see here. Oh yes, okay. Now we are in the year 1357 right now. Eventually, the Charnies and his wife Jean, they pass away. Well, he died in the battle, but eventually she dies as well. But it stays in their house, within their family, and they keep displaying it to people as time goes on. And eventually, word of this gets out everywhere. And so this is where we have kind of our first historical hiccup. We have our first skeptic who pops up, and this was a bishop in 1389. He writes a letter to Pope Clement, and he charged that the shroud that was being displayed here for people to come see was a fraud. He claimed that it was a painting by a known artist. The bishop had complained to King Charles VI of France about the king's assent to allowing the exhibition of the shroud. So the king allowed them to exhibit this thing. In response, first of all, the Pope's response to the bishop was basically to shut up. Because not only did the Pope have reasons for believing that the bishops, and his name was Bishop Arcis, or Arcus, not only did he have reasons to believe that he was not being honest, and that he was really just upset that he wasn't getting his way. The Pope seems to have thought that the image was authentic as well. So the image kept being on display. Oh, and it's also worth noting at this time that because the shroud was so popular at this point, that there were copies being made. There were duplicates and replicas being made. People were laying out cloths and painting their own images on them and trying to pass them off, and so that kind of thing. I think according to this, there's about 40 known replicas that were being passed around this time. But this is still the one that has strong historical ties to the past. So, what happens next in history? Eventually, the shroud gets passed down. It changes hands between different churches in France several times, and it starts to go on display much more rarely because people start getting really attached to it. So, for a couple of centuries there, for about a century, it just kind of passes around in France. Now, this is an important event that happens in 1532 to the shroud. In this chapel in Chambly, France, the shroud was being held there for a while, and the chapel almost completely burned down. It almost completely was destroyed. And the shroud was in a silver chest. It was folded up in a silver chest, and the silver chest started to melt because of the heat of the fire. A couple of locksmiths managed to pull the chest out and managed to pry it open, but they didn't get it open in time to save the shroud from being scorched by the fire. Fortunately, only one of its folded corners was burned. So from here on out, we have something that is worth noting is that different nuns at the churches where the shroud would end up, they started patching up the shroud. They also attached the Holland cloth to the back of it, because now that there were scorch marks in it, there were holes in it, and they wanted to put a backing on it so that you couldn't peek through it, because they still regarded it as a holy artifact. Let's see. Eventually, the shroud made its way, I believe at some point, I know I lost the detail here, but eventually the shroud ends up in the possession of the Catholic Church itself, and not just this rich family, although they kind of joint ownership of it. So in 1578, the shroud is officially moved to Turin, Italy, at the church there. It was owned by the House of Savoy at the time. They were the ones who I think the last guy who officially owned the shroud, he basically said as part of his will and testament, that when he was dead, that the Catholic Church would take possession of it, and that his dying wish was that the shroud would remain in Turin, Italy. And so it remains there to this day. You can see this is a picture of the shroud on display in 1613 in Turin. They would display it every now and then, probably like every 5 to 10 years. They would pop it out again on special occasions. Maybe if royalty got married or something like that, it was one of those things that would come out. But again, you can see it's the two-sided image of the cloth, supposedly bearing the image of Jesus. It's hard to make out, but he does have long hair and a beard. And from this point on, the image of Edessa and the Mandilion have been popular legends. But by this point, almost everybody in Europe knows about the Shroud of Turin, which is what it's now called because it's the shroud and it's in Turin. It's the Shroud of Turin now. Everybody knows about it, and it starts ridiculously affecting artwork of Jesus to like the meta point where people start painting images of Jesus in the shroud. So here's the image This is a 16th century painting by an Italian painter from the Renaissance. Not only does he paint the Shroud of Turin and the image on it, he paints how Jesus was laid in it, with his hands folded across his waist, his feet folded down here. And I'm sure one of those guys is Joseph of Arimathea, and you've got the Marys up there. So this is common. This, kind of like the other 6th century painting, this painting kind of gets duplicated by various people. So here's another painting. It looks like the same guy painted it again. It looks like he had some bigger ideas this time. He's got the whole Trinity in there now. Yeah, the Father and the Holy Spirit. Yeah. So this is all really exciting stuff, right? This is the Shroud of Turin. This is supposedly the cloth that Jesus was buried in. This is a huge legend. People would come from all over the world to come see this thing if they knew that it was going to be on display. Popes would make pilgrimages to visit it. Everybody would pay homage to it if they were in town for whatever reason or passing through. It was considered a holy artifact and a big deal. But I don't know if y'all have noticed or not, but y'all haven't actually seen a picture of the thing yet. You've only seen paintings of it. Well, in 1898, during a public exhibition of the Shroud of Turin, an Italian photographer named Secondo Pia took the first photographs of the mysterious artifact and officially ushered the Shroud of Turin into the age of science. This is from 1898. This is the crowd in the chapel of Turin holding the image. This is it on display above the altar. This is from 1898. You can already see, I mean, the guys who painted it before did a pretty good job. I mean, the dimensions, like the aspect ratio of this thing, they got it perfectly right. And I know it's kind of a blurry photo, but it's laid out exactly the same way. This is the head of the image, this is the front side of the body, and this is the back side. Here's a better picture of the whole thing. Now we're starting to see a lot more details in this thing. Notice that the image has a kind of a weird shading to it. Also notice that these triangles are where it was folded, and that's the corner that was burned in the fire. See, up until this point, nobody really studied the shroud. This is the front side image. People had only come to revere it, but since this was the first time that it was being photographed, Secondo Pia did his duty as a photographer, and he was actually, even in photography, he was considered kind of a pioneer because, I mean, in 1898, people were still kind of inventing their way through and, you know, kind of changing up the practice. So he had to pull out the stops to, first of all, get permission to take pictures of the shroud, and, I mean, to get good pictures. This is the head. Now, it should be noted at this point that, seeing as this is the first close-up photograph that we're seeing of it in 1898, something I want to point out is that the image is different than the blood stains. And there are blood stains on it. These are blood stains, and it's actual blood. And the image is not blood. You can see it does have some stains on it. Here's the corner burn marks. But are there any photographers in here? Guess not. Sort of. Notice anything strange about this image?
It's a negative.
It's a negative. image on the Shroud of Turin is a negative. So that Secondo Pia, biggest thing that he did was he realized this in 1898 when he took these pictures and he went to develop them in his studio, and he's looking at his photo negatives of the shroud. He discovers that when he's looking at his photo negatives, he's actually looking at the positive image of the shroud that's on the shroud. So this was revolutionary. This hit the newspapers like a train. I mean, it was just like boom. Everybody found out about this almost immediately, and suddenly this artifact that was revered as holy suddenly became like scientifically in question, because up until now people were like, wait a second, this thing's probably just some painting drizzled on a cloth, right? But who paints like this? Who paints photo negatives on a cloth that supposedly can be traced back to the 1st century? Or at the very least, if you want to be really strict with your history, at the very least, date it back to the 1300s. Nobody paints like that. So all of a sudden, you've got this crazy question. What's going on here? And just to be clear, if y'all aren't clear about what it means for a photo negative to be developed into positive, back in the old days when they took pictures on film, the film would render, literally, when you pulled it out, and hopefully you were in a dark room when you did so, the film would be negative like this, and it would have to develop into a positive image. So the fact that the shroud itself, not the pictures of it, but the shroud itself is a negative image, it just rings as weird. It almost makes it sound like, it almost looks like the shroud is a photograph, and an undeveloped photograph at that. So here is the whole thing, and this is the photo negative version, which is the positive version of the shroud. Something that was also became more clear to Secondo Pio when he took the pictures and when he realized this weird backwardness about the shroud is he also realized that when you look at the photo negative, meaning you're looking at the positive image of the shroud, a lot more details come out. So, I mean, I'm sure you probably noticed by now, but this is a lot more detailed of an image than the positive images you were looking at before. You can see that instead of seeing just the highlights from the positive image, now you can see kind of the whole shape of the body, and a lot of the wounds are more clear. The hands are particularly much more distinct, and you can see that the piercings are in the wrist. That is worth noting for future reference.
Look at his back.
Yes, his back is completely shredded by having obviously been flogged. And also notice that there are blood stains on the head, on the front and the back side. There's also flogging lines all down the back of the legs. I know when I see this, I just think to myself, they did a pretty good job in The Passion of the Christ at depicting just what Jesus suffered. Oh, here's a better image of the hands. Close-up image anyway. Another strange thing you might think you're seeing, and you're correct, is you can see the skeleton of the hands. You can see the flesh around them and the bones on the inside, which now, so I mean, before we had a photo negative, now we have a photo negative X-ray. And this, I mean, Secondo Pita didn't know what to think of this stuff when he discovered all of this. All right, so obviously almost a century passed by, and the shroud becomes more and more under the scrutiny of science. There are more and more skeptics who are trying to say, we need to get in there. We need to figure out what this thing is. At this point, it's strange to think that it could be a painting, but it's possible. We know that there were brilliant painters in the past, and who's not to say that somebody didn't think this up. So finally, after decades of negotiating with the Catholic Church, in October of 1978, a team of about a dozen scientists called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP, as they're called, they were granted special permission from the Catholic Church to conduct an extensive 5-day-long hands-on investigation of the shroud. This was unprecedented. This had never been allowed before, especially because most of the guys on this team were not Christians. I wish that I could go into the details of what these guys believed going in and what they believed going out, but we just don't have time for all that tonight. We have their results to look at. So this is a picture of a couple of them. They've mounted the shroud in this rotating frame where they can hold it up vertically like this, but they can also lay it down flat. They pick it up vertically like this so that they can shine light through it. Like I said, this was they knew that they had to make the best use of this time as they possibly could, so they took turns, they took shifts in doing their research on the shroud. And I'm fixing to go over what they did, but I mean, for 120 hours straight, there was always someone with the shroud doing something to it or trying to find something on it or something. So here's the list of things that here's them mounting it on the frame that they specially designed for this. Notice that they're being very careful. They were very respectful of it. And this is all the stuff that they had permission to do. They did photographic floodlighting, so when they stood it up, they would shine incredibly bright lights through it so that it would illuminate it from the back side, so that they could take much more clear pictures from the front. Sometimes there's damage to old artifacts like this from flashes, so this is a better way to do it. Especially since, remember, the cloth has a backing cloth on the back side of it that was sewn on to kind of patch it up. Remember that. They also tested it with low power x-rays, x-rayed it. They used narrowband ultraviolet light to scan the surface of it for blood stains and various other things that might have been on the surface. They used sticky tape samples to press down and pull little whatever was on it. They pulled off with sticky tape only in certain sections. Obviously, the church was adamant that they not disrupt the image. Obviously, anything that they could possibly not do to the image was preferred, especially to the front side, and especially the closer to the face you get, yeah, they couldn't go there. So what else did they do? A side edge of it was unstitched so that they could look between the shroud itself and the backing cloth. And it's just cool to note that nobody had seen the backside of the cloth in over 400 years since they did this. So they actually unstitched a side of it. They untied it. They didn't cut it. They untied it and looked behind there and dug around to see if there was anything in there. They obtained blood-stained samples from the lumbar region, the back side, the lower back, and it was real blood. And besides that, they took thousands of photographs and photomicrographs, meaning they took photographs of it from the outside, and they also took microscopic photos of it close up, pictures of the individual fibers that compose it, images of the blood stains, of the image itself, and anywhere that they possibly could. The results? This is them unstitching that side and looking underneath. Okay. This is where things are going to get crazy. This is what they discovered in 1978. First of all, what do you think they thought when they walked in there? I'll tell you what they thought. But they thought they were going to walk in, grab a scalpel or a popsicle stick or something, and scratch the paint off of this thing and blow it off their hand and say, "Good night, everybody." Well, guess what? There was not a single drop of paint on this cloth. I just threw this picture up there just so you can see again how the shroud obviously influenced. That's the 6th century painting from before. So this is, the similarity is incredible. There's even something weird going on with the left eye. They even reflected that in the painting. That's how clear it was to me. Just to make sure I get all this straight, I have to read it. Extensive, sophisticated research has shown a complete lack of paint, dye, stain, ink, acids, pigments, powders, or any substance that an artist would use to make an image. No substance causing the image has been found to bind the fibrils together. The fibrils are, we'll see more about this in a moment. The fibrils, a fibril is the fiber of the fiber. So the cloth is weaved with thin fibers, and those fibers are made up of fibrils. You know how it is. If you've ever played with a piece of string, you know that it's made up of even tinier pieces of string. Same is true of the shroud. Well, the next thing there's one more thing. Another thing to take note of the image as well is that besides the fact that there was no paint, there was no stains, there were no powders or pigments or whatever, there was no ink, computer analysis shows a complete lack of directionality to the image, meaning it lacks brush strokes, pastel or pencil streaks, finger smudging, or shading. This is what computer analysis was able, and a lot of this, by the way, computer analysis has taken place over the decades since 1978, because nobody has had access to the Shroud of Turin since then. So we're still dealing with the data that we got in 1978. So a lot of technology has been developed to test the results and the samples that were taken from the Shroud of Turin, and this is just one of them. As computers have grown more advanced over the decades, we're able to perform even better computer analysis of the data that we have. So there's no strokes to it. Here's another crazy thing. The image is only 1 fibril deep. Not a fiber, a fibril. And I hope that you can kind of see this, because this is a close-up image of Jesus' nose. This is the whole fiber, and these are the little fibers that make up, the little fibrils that make up the fiber. The image is only on the topmost fibrils, not on the ones under it. It's not even on like, here's the thing, if you move one of these fibrils, you find that the fibril under it has a streak on it because it didn't even go through that topmost fibril to the one under it. The image is literally only on these topmost fibrils, and we know this because of these photomicrographs that they took. The image is completely superficial to the uppermost fibrils on the surface of the fibers that make up the cloth, one fibril deep. It does not bleed through or run along the fibrils in any kind of capillary action. Also, the image is absent under where one fibril crosses another, like I just said, where they cross. This eliminates any fluid cause and is only observable under a microscope. In other words, no fluid was used to cause the image. An artist, if an artist did this, they would have an impossible task of painting tiny fibrils one at a time without getting any pigment on the fibril below it or in between the other fibrils. Who thinks up this stuff? God, I'm convinced. We're not even done yet. Can't handle any more of this. The image is three-dimensionally shaded, and it's hard to do this without. There's plenty of videos, you can go find them on the internet that put motion to it because it's a lot easier to grasp. This is not the image itself. This is a three-dimensional rendering of the image. But if you take the shading of the image and you convert it to 3D elements, you'll find that the darker the image is, like in an analysis like this, the darker the image is, the more protruded it is, and that the lighter it is, the farther away it is from the camera.
It works like a height map.
Yeah.
So like a
height map.
Yeah, exactly.
So the shading of the image produces a three-dimensional picture when analyzed by a computer, meaning the lighter the image, the farther away the body was from the cloth. Similar analysis of a photograph or painting does not produce a three-dimensional image. I want you to pick up on that. Photographs don't even work this way. We can't do the same thing with photographs. You can't take a photograph and assume that the lighter parts of it are parts that are farther away. Which means that whereas before we were calling the shroud a photo negative, we can't even do that anymore. We can't even call it a photo negative anymore. Because it's got this weird attribute to it. Here's another interesting thing. The image is better seen from a distance. This is a close-up picture of the hands and a close-up picture of from the front side of the pierced wrist, the blood stains there. Again, those are real blood stains. But if you're standing right up close to the Shroud of Turin, you can't really see the image. You kind of have to stand back to see the whole thing, to kind of get an idea of the picture. Thankfully, we have good photography that's able to capture an image like this, but if you were standing in front of the shroud itself, you probably wouldn't be able to even see it this good. And the hands were certainly not that big. The closer one gets to the cloth, the less visible the image is. It is only discernible by the naked eye at a distance of approximately 6 to 10 feet, making it impossible for an artist to create at close range. So again, if an artist did this, what did he do? Not only would he have to run up to it and paint one little fibril, then he'd have to run 10 feet away and look at it and be like, yeah, and then do another fibril. There's probably someone crazy enough to try. There's another strange attribute to it. It has negative shading. So the image is a negative, which became surprisingly evident when it was first photographed in 1898 by Secondo Theo. The image is far more detailed and clear in a photographic negative than looking at the actual positive image. So this is a positive image of the shroud. The dark areas of the shroud represent those areas of closest contact when a cloth is draped over a body. When reversed, it looks more natural. So the darker the shading on the positive, the regular shroud, the closer the skin was to the linen. So, I mean, the nose and the beard are the darkest parts, so the linen was laying right across the face. Also, the top of the wrist on the right hand is very well shaded as well as the top of the thighs. And the feet at the bottom. The feet keep getting cut off. They're there, you can see them. I don't think I got a good picture of them. Let's see what else is going on here. The fibrils that are affected by the image, or the fibrils that have the image on them, seem to be, I mean, we've already determined it's not paint, right? So what is it? So what is the image? So it looks like that those fibrils are aged. The darker fibrils causing the image are dark because they are more aged. The cellulose comprising the fibrils has undergone a dehydrating oxidizing reaction, causing it to age faster than the others. The darker areas of the image contain quantitatively more darkened fibrils. The fibrils themselves are all the same shade. That's kind of hard to wrap your mind around, but hopefully that's going to click in a moment the more we move on. The fact that they're aged. What causes something to age quickly? We'll get there. Also, the burn holes. A natural experiment by the burning and a subsequent dousing of water caused by a fire in 1532 failed to affect the image in any way. So, in other words, fire and water do not have effects like melting or running on artists' materials. Though the fire did burn large holes in the shroud, the majority of the image was unaffected. What this means is that where the burn meets the image isn't affected, except that it's not there, it was burned away. But like around the burn scorch marks, the image doesn't run, it's not faded in any way, it's just the same. So, and also the fact that it was doused with water in the flood at Odessa, according to legend, seems to have not affected the image at all. Likewise. So, yeah. This is crazy stuff. A mass spectrometer was used on it. Mass spectrometer analysis revealed no aloes, no oils, no proteins, no myrrh, or natural substances that could have caused the image by contact with a dead body. If the image has a purely natural cause, one would expect other images on other burial cloths to have been found. What this means, in spite of all this science lingo, is that I was going to put a picture of this in here, but I decided not to, just for reasons of taste. But when bodies decay on linen surfaces or anything like that, if they're left there long enough, they will leave a decomposition stain. Actually, I might get to that later. Sure. They leave a decomposition stain, but the fact is that the shroud does not have any decomposition stains on it at all. So obviously, if there was a body wrapped in this thing, it didn't decompose. That's the take-home message. also, the image is weight independent. Think about this. If the body of the man, whoever was wrapped in the shroud, was lying on the backside, then wouldn't you think that the image of the backside would be darker than the front side? Maybe, especially if he was like painted or something, you know. But that's not the case. The image is equally dark and light. It seems like weight had nothing to do with the image being created. Pressure independent, weight is irrelevant, yes. So, how did the image get there? What's the deal? Well, here's what we can kind of determine about the image is that it was vertically projected onto the linen. However it got there, it was vertically projected. So, in other words, if I am, well, think about when you look at my shadow on the screen, you're seeing the edges of light pass around my shadow, right? You're seeing a vertical projection of light going past my arm and my shoulders and my head onto the screen. Well, in the case of the shroud, all of the image was vertically affected, but was vertically projected. So the significance of this is, imagine if you painted your face, say you just completely covered your face in paint, and then you took a cloth and you wrapped the cloth around your painted face, and then you pulled it off. What would you see? You would see a photo of your face. You would see a smudgy, kind of blobby version of your face. But the shroud isn't like that. It's not as if the image was wrapped around his head or any other part of his body. It's as if you were just looking straight down at the body, that the image would come straight up at you. Just like light. Where am I? Oh. Yeah. Oh, and the other clue to this as well, and this is weird too. Notice that even though the image is of the front side and the back side, that the top of the head, where the image went over and folded over the top of his head, is not. It's not part of the image. So literally, however the image got there, it passed vertically through and didn't affect this part of the shroud at all. Passed vertically through, just like this. Again, it's like, what do you make of this? It's like, once you determine this kind of thing, there's no conclusion to draw from it. That's just the way it is. Here's a picture of it on display. Actually, this might be a replica, I'm not sure. I just Googled that. So no attempt to duplicate the image has ever been successful, and research and duplication attempts have eliminated pretty much everything you can think of. Believe me, tons of people have tried to duplicate this image in crazy ways, which include direct contact, like painting your face and draping a cloth over it, diffusion, lab-induced radiation, engraving, powdered bas-reliefs, electrostatic imaging, phosphorescent statues, hot statues, and hot bas-reliefs as possible causes. There's one particularly clever idea of a sort of an ancient concept of photography where a cloth was laid over like a hole in a wall, or no, I'm sorry, it wasn't laid over. It was inside, and you would shine light through the hole, and then onto the linen, and there would be a statue on the other side, and supposedly, theoretically, maybe the light that's bouncing off, because anything you look at, you're seeing the light that's bouncing off of it, right? So theoretically, if you were looking through the hole at the statue, at the bust of the head, right, then there's light coming at it from you. So theoretically, if you have the right kind of cloth and you know what you're doing, then maybe the light that's bouncing off the statue, if it's actually being projected on a linen cloth for long enough, maybe it'll create an image. Well, that was clever, but it didn't work. And there's tons of ways. And you know, people have actually come kind of close to producing something of like the substance of the image, if that makes any sense, but they never get an image like this. What they get is blobby images. They get what like a decomposition stain looks like, which is just a blur. At best, you might be able to make out, I mean, the most distinct thing about a decomposition stain, depending on how a decomposing body is lying, is just that it has legs and arms. There's nothing else you can tell about it. So like I said, there's no, best we can tell, the image is not of human origin. It's just not. The image is not of human origin. A medieval artist capable of making something like this surely would have taken credit for it and done more. But we don't have anything. So, what is the best explanation for how the image got on the shroud? The best explanation for the image is vertical, low energy X-ray radiation, or some other kind of radiation, emanating from a body under the cloth, causing the fibrils to prematurely age faster than the rest of the cloth. That is the best explanation that science can provide. Which is ironic because there is no natural explanation for how that would happen. We're still not done. Now that we've kind of analyzed the image, let's talk about the other stuff that was on the shroud. The medical and forensic analysis. I'm going to go through this a lot quicker because I'm not a doctor. The actual human blood that was found on it was type AB. So whoever was on it was type AB blood. X and Y chromosomes were found showing that the blood came from a male. And the DNA is degraded like most ancient DNA is, so there will be no cloning of the man in the shroud. Just got that out of the way. The blood.
Jesus, part 2.
The return. The second coming. The blood shows evidence of clotting. The blood shows evidence of clotting with serum present in it as well. The serum evidence is not visible to the eye, particularly on the scourge marks, and is not missing from any of them. In other words, I mean, most of you probably scraped your knee bad enough to where not only is it bleeding, right, but it's also kind of oozing. That stuff sticks around just like blood does. It dries up in the blood. And so when you analyze dried blood, you can find out how bad was the wound. Did you just break your finger, or were you like gushing from the inside? There is serum all in the blood stains on the shroud, particularly on the flogging wounds. Exactly where you would expect them to be. The blood is thicker than a healthy human and shows evidence of low oxygen content, which would be consistent with asphyxiation, which is the medical cause of death when someone is crucified. They are asphyxiated, they can't breathe. The color and blood chemistry are consistent with crucifixion. Blood flows on the scalp are anatomically correct, showing both venous and arterial flows corresponding to the frontal vein and superficial temple artery. Basically, the blood is coming from the right places. It's not just drizzled on there artistically. The watery fluid around the side wound, did you notice yet that there was a side wound? The watery fluid around the side wound is from either the pericardial sac or the pleural cavity, pleural effusion, consistent with what surgeon and doctors agree happens during crucifixion, during asphyxiation. The lungs eventually fill up with this fluid. And it's present in that blood. Again, there is no decomposition stain on the shroud, unlike other ancient burial cloths. Believe me, we find ancient dead people a lot. There's always decomposition stains on them. Mummies, not just mummies, but just any body that's fairly well preserved, doesn't have to be mummified, which again means that the body left the shroud before decomposition occurred. I'm not a doctor, so I don't know if like 3 days is enough, but I guess not. Still not done. The thumbs are not visible, which is consistent with research performed on cadavers, dead bodies, showing that a nail driven through the wrist will cause the thumbs to draw up, especially when hung under the weight of the body. So, in other words, they've tested dead bodies and crucified them to see what the medical result of crucifixion is, and when you drive a nail through the wrist, the thumb curls up, especially when it's hanging under weight. And so, since the thumbs are not present, this would seem to indicate that this victim was crucified. The rib cage is abnormally expanded, which is kind of hard to see in this picture. Yeah, is abnormally expanded, and the pectoral muscles are drawn up toward the collarbone, which is consistent with crucifixion as well. If you're hanging, all of that stuff is going to get pulled up. The abdomen is distended, and the epigastric hollow is drawn in, again consistent with what would be expected of a crucifixion victim. Thank goodness that Secondo Pio discovered that the negative positive image of the shroud is so clear, because I mean this is the kind of information we get. And of course Stirp took incredible photographs as well, which is pretty much where most of these photographs you're seeing came from. Let's see. Still not done. What does that mean, right? The body is in rigor mortis. Do y'all know what that means? When a person or an animal dies, I mean, sometimes you see it in roadkill. If you ever drive by, like say a dead deer, and you see that its legs are actually like sticking out, that's rigor mortis, is that there's a period in the decomposition process where the body returns to the position it was in when it died. It's kind of a strange medical thing that happens, but it happens. It happens to everybody. So the body is in rigor mortis, which is evident from the fact that the feet are in the crucifixion position. In other words, one foot is laid over the top of the other. The posture of the legs is bent. The thumbs are drawn in, which, if you were wondering, well, why would they still be drawn in if he's not being crucified anymore? The answer is rigor mortis. The head is tilted slightly to one side and forward, like it would be in crucifixion. The chest and the abdomen are frozen in their crucifixion position, and there is no flattening of the buttocks and thighs from the weight of the body. They are in a stiff position, which is consistent with rigor mortis as well. Of course, the way that we can tell this is because, like I said before, the weight of the body has no effect on the details of the image. Remember? So that is what helps make it clear to us that the body is in rigor mortis, which, by the way, happens early in decomposition, not later. There are scrapes to the knees, nose, and cheek, which is consistent with a possible fall from a heavy object on the shoulders. Dirt was also found in these areas, as if he hit the ground with his face. The weight on the shoulders came after the scourging because the scourge marks are deformed in this area. Don't ask me how they came to that conclusion, but that's what they gathered from this image here, is that first the victim was scourged, and then the weight of a heavy object on the shoulders disfigured the wounds from flogging. The scourge marks are outlined with serum from clotting blood, which is invisible to the naked eye, and there are more than 100 of them. This seems inconceivable as an artist's detail. So not only are there flogging wounds, but around each of them is the serum that you would expect to be there. The wound in the side, which maybe you can see it now where it's not highlighted. The wound in the side is post-mortem, evident from there's no swelling like there is in the face and the scourge wounds, and the blood flow is smaller than it would have been alive, and the blood flow shows evidence of oozing. Many of the blood flows are likely from oozing caused by moving a dead body. The directions of the blood flows also show multiple positions of the body, including blood flows down both arms at angles of 55 to 65 degrees, consistent with crucifixion. In other words, blood, if you're hanging like this, then blood is flowing down your arm, which is what this is. Blood running down the arm. The cloth is not damaged in the areas where there is dry blood, like would be expected from removing a bandage stuck to a wound. The body left the cloth without disturbing the blood stains. So if you were bleeding profusely and you crawled out of your burial cloth, there would be smears from the blood stains, right? There's no smears. Multiple states of blood: venous, arterial, clotting, pre-mortem, post-mortem, low oxygen content from physical exertion are beyond the knowledge of a medieval forger. A forger putting blood on the shroud would not have known that there was any detectable difference to different states of blood, and wouldn't even know where to put the different blood in the correct places on the shroud. Probably would have used pig's blood and just sprinkled it around, you know? But we already know that it's type AB blood from a man. The image makes it possible to do a photo autopsy of the man to see if it matches actual damage done by crucifixion, and it does. Anatomical details of the dead body are too accurate for a forger in the 12th or 13th century. The conclusion is that the shroud wrapped a real, dead human body. Now,